I'm going to just give you an overview of the situation in England. It's really a talk of three parts. I'm going to look at the reason that we introduced our programme, the introduction of the programme and how that's gone. I'm going to look at some of the genetic changes that we've seen, and I'm going to look at some of the clinical information that we've also collected. So I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with meningococcal disease, but just to give you a little bit of background, meningococcal disease is an invasive bacterial infection caused by the Diplococcus Neisseria meningitidis. There are 12 capsular groups that have been recognised, so this is based on the outer polysaccharide capsule of the organism, and of the groups that have been identified, men A, B, C, W, X and Y account for most human disease, and it is a human-specific organism. In fact, invasive disease is an unusual outcome of infection, and carriage is very common, around 10% overall, and much higher in older teenagers and young adults, as we'll see. The most common clinical presentations are septicemia and meningitis, either together or alone, but there are other clinical presentations that we see, and again, we'll touch on those later. Of course, this is a disease that is feared by both parents and clinicians alike, and we know through attitudinal work that we've done that this is the disease that parents are most frightened of for their children. And of course, that is partly the high associated case fatality rate, which is around 10% overall, but this varies based on a number of factors such as age, capsular groups, so we see higher fatality rates with C and W, for example, compared to B, and also with clinical presentation. So if you present with septicemia, you have a far greater risk of dying from that disease. There are also long-term complications associated. Around 1 in 8 survivors experience long-term complications. These are things like brain damage, deafness, epilepsy, of course limb and digit loss in association with septicemia. And more than 95% of our cases tend to be sporadic, but it is also associated with some outbreaks in families or schools or universities or military institutions. In terms of incidence, this varies globally, and just focusing here on Europe, what I wanted to highlight is that the UK has always had a high incidence of meningococcal disease, together with, at this point, which was 2009, Iceland and Ireland. And if we move to more recent data, 2014, we've actually seen a reduction in disease pretty much across Europe in that time, but the UK is still the fourth highest, has still the fourth highest incidence within Europe, behind now Malta and Lithuania and Ireland. Just to give you a little bit of background to our programme, because this has changed along the way, the United Kingdom was the first country to introduce vaccination against MenC disease with the meningococcal conjugate vaccine, and this was in late 1999 with a 2, 3, 4 month infant programme, so it's different from the programme that you introduced here in Holland. And we had a catch-up programme for everyone up to 18 years of age at that time. And that was delivered over about a year. So it was quite a huge undertaking at that time. We've seen a number of changes to the programme since that time, with boosters introduced at 12 months, and this is a Hib MenC vaccine given, it's called Monitrix, and also with the removal of some of those infant doses, the introduction of an adolescent booster at 14 years of age, because actually what we've learnt is that antibodies wane very rapidly following not only the infant programme but also the booster given at 12 months of age. Much more recently, so at the end of last year, we again were the first country to introduce Bexsero vaccine. This is a licensed MenB vaccine with a 2, 4 and 12-month schedule, and we subsequent to that removed the dose that was given in infancy for the MenC programme, and changed to a Men-ACWY adolescent booster from the MenC originally, and we'll focus on that anyway. So over this period of time, what we've seen is a very dramatic decrease in MenC disease, not surprisingly. This is both through direct and herd protection following the introduction of the MenC programme, but we've also seen an overall reduction of IMD throughout that period of time. Although what you see here, and we're going to focus on this, is this increase in W disease. And in fact, we have seen a slight increase in Y as well, although that seems to have stabilised at around 100 cases a year at the moment. But of course, one of the issues for us in introducing the MenB programme has been this reduction in MenB disease, which made it very difficult for us to show cost effectiveness, which is something that we legally have to do in order to bring in a new vaccine programme. So focusing on MenW disease specifically, and the data that I show you will all be laboratory confirmed cases of meningococcal disease. That's what we base our surveillance on. And here what we can see is high levels of disease in the early 2000s. And this was something that was a global phenomenon and was associated with pilgrims returning from the Hajj who went on to develop MenW disease, and actually that was then spread amongst their close contacts, although didn't spread out within the broader population at that time. That's been quite well controlled following the introduction of compulsory vaccination prior to travel to Mecca for the Hajj. And since that point, we've had very low levels of MenW disease. It's accounted for less than 5% of our total meningococcal disease through these sort of middle years. However, from around 2009 onwards, we began to see this increase that began to double each year. So we, from 2012-13, we had around 55 cases, then we went to 95 cases, then to 176 cases in 2014-15. So this was very worrying because we were seeing a very dramatic increase in disease at that time. What we knew about the disease was that this was a member of the ST11 clonal complex, which is a hypervirulent, hyperinvasive strain associated with increases in disease incidence through different periods and with a high case fatality rate. So we've seen various CC11 outbreaks previously as Group C disease in the UK and Europe in the 1990s, and that was what led to the introduction of the conjugate vaccine at that time, as Group W with that Hajj-associated outbreak I've just mentioned, Group W in African epidemics, which began around 2002 and lasted for 2 or 3 years, and as Group W, which sort of emerged in Brazil, in South America, then spread to Argentina and then to Chile, and also in South Africa from around 2003 onwards. So this is something that is quite concerning when you begin to see an increase in a W CC11 strain within your population. Now, in this, at the time that the JCVI looked at these data, what we knew was not only that we were seeing this very marked, very rapid increase in W disease within our population, and that in itself was a concern because of previous experience, but Chile had at that point introduced a vaccination program following the increases in disease that they'd seen, and that targeted children under 5 years of age. And although that had had a marked impact on disease in that target age group, it hadn't had any effect on the rest of the population, and they'd continued to see an increase in W disease. We did have W cases that were occurring in infants, which was quite unusual, as well as all other age groups. So this was a situation where we were seeing W spread across the population geographically, but also across all age groups. And we had evidence that Bexzero, this MenB licensed vaccine, because it's based on proteins that are below the capsule, actually has the prospect of protecting against a broader range of meningo groups across different capsules. And there was evidence that it would protect against the MenW strain that we were seeing within the population. So the JCVI considered that the only feasible strategy, or the best strategy, was to target the carrier, the high carrier group, with the conjugate ACWY vaccine. And that is focused in is focused, as I've mentioned, in these older teenagers and young adults, where it can reach levels of around 25% carriage in these age groups. And we know that the reason why the MenC vaccine program has been so successful is because we had that mass catch-up, which actually took carriage out of the population and then had a herd protective effect. So they recommended that 14 to 18-year-olds and new university entrants should be offered MenACWY vaccination. And the vaccines that we're using are MenVeo and Niemann-Rix, which are CRIM and tetanus conjugated, respectively, vaccines with ACWY components. Now, the program itself is quite complex. You don't need to take this in detail. This is just really to highlight that the strategy aimed to offer vaccine to all children aged 13 to 18 years in the 2014-15 academic year. So this is our catch-up cohort. And it began with vaccination of those who left school in 2015. So they would have been 18 before the 1st of September 2015. And we have about half of our school leavers that go on to higher education. So we've since immunised these children as well, and by 2017-18, we will have completed the catch-up, and we will just be doing routine vaccination. It's year 9 in England, that is children who are 13, 14 years of age. Okay, so what have we seen since the vaccine programme has been introduced? Uptake. Now this, what I'm showing you, is based on our school leaver programme, and I would say that these are children who have been called back by general practitioners to be vaccinated. The younger children will be offered vaccine at schools, and we expect coverage to be much higher in those age groups based on our previous experience. So this is a little disappointing. 37% uptake in school leavers last year, and these are early data here for this year's school leavers, and I believe that they're already up to around this level, and we're hoping they may be higher, but it's very difficult to motivate this age group to go to their GP and take up the offer of vaccination, even against a disease like this. What we do know, however, is that in the new university students, the coverage is likely to be higher. And we also know that this is the group that are at particular risk of meningococcal disease. We've just done a study where it looks like their risk of meningococcal disease is about 10 times higher than their peers. And some universities are quite active in offering vaccination opportunistically to their students. So we know that one university, the University of Nottingham, managed to sort of collar students as they arrived at university, pretty much. They had the Meningitis Now charity staff available to talk to them about meningococcal disease, and they raised coverage from 31% when students arrived to 71%. So it is likely that in these high-risk groups we have got higher coverage. However, since that time, so this is showing cumulative cases by epidemiological year. So our epidemiological year runs from July one year to June the following year to capture that winter period. What we can see is this, so this was the year in which the vaccine was introduced, when we had those 176 cases. In fact, we continued to see an increase, but that virtual doubling of cases didn't continue into 2015-16. So we had an increase of, I think it was about 14% that year. However, we have continued to see an increase this year, and I just updated this recently, so this goes to the end of October, and we are still running ahead of where we were at this point last year, so we need to obviously continue to look at this. However, when we look at the age distribution, what we can see is pretty much across the board an increase in all age groups, with the exception, the 20 to 24-year-old age group had the highest proportionate increase in 2015-16, whereas the 15 to 19-year-old, where our vaccinated groups are, had a decrease. So we fell there from 25 to 20 cases in that cohort. So this is very encouraging. Okay, so we're moving on to the next part of the talk, which is really looking at how closely related those WCC11 outbreaks are. And this is largely based on work done by Jay Lucidarm at the Meningococcal Reference Unit in Manchester, and I'd like to thank him for use of his slides. You'll see, I understand he spends a long time putting these together, and I think you'll see why in a moment. So this group took diverse CC11 isolates with genomes that were published on the Meningitis Research Foundation meningococcal genome library. So this was set up to make these genomes widely available for this type of work. They looked at 750 isolates from W, C and B capsular groups from 25 countries across 6 continents over 6 decades. It was a big piece of work. And they focused on around 1,500 gene loci, which are highly, you would expect to see in the majority of organisms. So these are kind of considered core genes. And I don't know if you've seen these phylogenetic trees previously. I think they're actually quite intuitive when you look at them, but we're just basically plotting the genetic distribution of the organism, and the closer together these are, the more closely related they are, essentially. So in summary, this is where those Haj outbreak strains, the Haj outbreak strain sits, the isolates from the Haj in 2000. This is where the sub-Saharan African strain isolates sit, the South African isolates, and you can see that those are all very closely related. And it was originally thought that these outbreaks in South America and in England were probably linked to this original Haj strain. However, the South American isolates and the isolates from England are actually quite distal to those original Haj cases. And so in summary, what this means is that there appears to be a single strain responsible for the UK increase, which is distinct from that original Haj and the South African strains, and that the UK strain is very closely related to the strains that have been seen in South America. What Jay then went on to do was look at the distribution of cases within England and Wales. And here we can see the first 5 cases in isolates from, not first 5 cases, but the first 5 isolates available in 2009-10. And these were located very closely together on the phylogenetic tree. And as we move through time, we see the spread of this strain across England and Wales. And by 2012-13, what you might see is these cases over here, which appear to be evolving differently from the others. So they're clustering elsewhere on this genetic tree. And in fact, we've seen a continued expansion of this. And what this has led Jay and colleagues to conclude is that the original UK strain, which accounted for that original increase here, has actually now, we've now moved on to see the emergence of a new strain following that interim strain there. And that new strain is actually what's accounting for this continued increase in W disease. And it's this strain, which we're calling the 2013 strain, which appears to have spread. We've kindly spread that to our European colleagues. Okay, so just for the final part of the talk, I'm going to look at some of the clinical characteristics of our MenW cases. This wasn't unique to England. In fact, in Chile, they'd also observed this, and they say in this paper that 14 of 58 cases were wrongly diagnosed as being gastrointestinal gastroenteritis originally, and that of those 14, 8 went on to die. So it has got a high case fatality rate associated, and it's something that was observed in Chile. And here you can see the observation that diarrhea was the second most common symptom found amongst deceased patients. So I'd just like to thank Jay Lucidam and Shemez Ladani in particular, and also other colleagues at PHE, and also obviously the general practitioners and others who've provided data that's allowed us to look at this. Thank you.